Welcome, friends. Tonight we're setting out on a difficult journey. We're going to visit the graves of 30 beloved screen legends, whose final chapters were written far from the spotlights that once found them. Some of them died in rented rooms in cities they'd once ruled. Some died in charity wards, in county hospitals, in boarding houses where nobody at the front desk recognized the name on the register. Some died surrounded by strangers. A few died with no one at all. What connects them is not the loneliness of a single moment, but something longer and sadder. They were forgotten while they were still alive. The studios that had built them let their contracts lapse. The friends who had ridden their coattails stopped calling. The fan mail slowed to a trickle and then stopped. And when the end came, sometimes it took days for anyone to notice. We're not here to pity them tonight. We're here to remember them, to speak their names again in the order the world stopped speaking them, to stand at the graves that most people drive right past without ever knowing who's underneath. Some of these graves are grand. A few of them didn't even have markers for years because there was no one left to pay for one. All of them belong to people who once made audiences laugh, weep, gasp, and fall in love. So settle in. Pour yourself something warm. And let's begin where any story of Hollywood forgetting its own must begin, on a windy hillside above the city that made her famous. Our first stop takes us up into the Hollywood Hills, to a spot that has become as much a monument as any grave. There is no headstone for Peg Entwistle. There is no plot, no urn on display, no marker any pilgrim can visit. What she left behind instead is a sign. 9 white letters standing 45 feet tall against the brown California hillside, spelling out the name of the city that broke her heart. Peg Entwistle was born Millicent Lillian Entwistle in Port Talbot, Wales, in 1908. Her mother died when she was small. Her father brought her to America when she was 6, and then he too was killed, struck by a truck on Park Avenue in New York City, when she was 14. She was raised after that by an uncle in Los Angeles, and she made her way to the stage the way orphans sometimes do, by needing somewhere to belong. She was good. That's the thing people forget. She wasn't a failure who came to Hollywood chasing something she couldn't reach. She was a working Broadway actress who had appeared in more than a dozen productions by her early 20s. A young Bette Davis saw her perform in Boston in a production of The Wild Duck, and later said that watching Peg Entwistle on that stage was the moment she decided to become an actress herself. Think about that for a moment. The woman who would become the fiercest actress of her generation credited her entire career to a girl whose name almost no one remembers today. Peg came to Hollywood in 1932. She had a small role in an RKO picture called 13 Women, alongside Myrna Loy and Irene Dunne. The studio previewed the film, decided her scenes weren't working, and cut most of them. Her contract was not renewed. She was 24 years old, and she was already being discarded. She had been sending letters home that summer, cheerful letters. Letters that promised she was fine and that things were about to turn around. They weren't. The depression had gutted the theater world she'd come from. Her savings were nearly gone. Her uncle's house was crowded and tense. She was, by every account of people who saw her that August, quietly falling apart in a city that had no interest in catching her. On the evening of the 16th of September, 1932, Peg told her uncle she was going out to meet friends at a drugstore on Hollywood Boulevard. She left her purse and her shoes at his house. She walked, in what must have been miles of hard uphill going, up Beechwood Canyon and up the fire trail behind the ridge, to the maintenance ladder on the back of the letter H in the Hollywoodland sign. The sign in those days advertised a real estate development. It had 13 letters, not 9, and each of them was lit at night with hundreds of bulbs. She climbed the 50-foot ladder to the top of the H, folded her coat neatly beside her, and jumped. Her body wasn't found for 2 days. A hiker discovered a woman's coat, a purse, and a pair of shoes at the base of the sign, along with a note. The note read, in part, "I am afraid. I am a coward. I am sorry for everything." If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain. Here is the part of the story that has haunted Hollywood for 90 years. A letter arrived at her uncle's house the day after her death. It was from the Beverly Hills Playhouse. They wanted to cast her in the lead of their next production. The role was a young woman driven to take her own life. Peg Entwistle's body was cremated. Her ashes were sent to Ohio, where her father was buried, and interred at Oak Hill Cemetery in the town of Glendale in a family plot. but her true monument stands here on this hillside. In 1949, the last four letters of the Hollywoodland sign were removed. What was left became the sign we know today. And every visitor who has ever taken a photograph of it, every tourist who has ever pointed at those white letters against the brown hill, has stood in the shadow of a girl who climbed one of them and never came down. She was forgotten so quickly that when the papers reported her death, most of them got her name wrong. From that windy hillside, we travel down into the city itself, to Hollywood Forever Cemetery on Santa Monica Boulevard. This 6.2-acre cemetery shares a wall with Paramount Studios, which is either poetic or cruel depending on the resident. Rudolph Valentino is here. Cecil B. DeMille is here. Tyrone Power is here. And in a modest plot in the Abbey of the Psalms, mausoleum lies a man who was, for one brief, incandescent year, the biggest comedy star in the movies. His name was Carl Dane, though he was born Rasmus Carl Thurkelson Gottlieb in Copenhagen, Denmark, in 1886. He came to America in 1916 with almost nothing, worked as a machinist and a mechanic, and drifted west toward Hollywood the way tall, interesting-looking men often did in those years. He was 6'3", gangly, with a long, sad face that could break into the warmest grin anyone had ever seen. King Vidor cast him in 1925 in a picture called The Big Parade, playing a doughboy named Slim in a World War I regiment. The film became one of the highest-grossing pictures of the entire silent era. Carl Dane became a star overnight. MGM signed him to a long contract. They paired him with a diminutive English comedian named George K. Arthur, and the two of them made a series of tremendously popular comedies through the late 1920s. Dane earned $1,500 a week at his peak, which in 1928 was a fortune. He bought a house in the Hollywood Hills. He married. He posed for the fan magazines with his big Danish grin and his long legs stretched out in a director's chair. Then sound came. And Carl Dane's thick Danish accent, the accent that had never mattered when audiences couldn't hear him, suddenly mattered enormously. His voice on film was almost unintelligible to American audiences. MGM tried him in a few talkies, watched the previews, and quietly dropped him in 1933. His contract was not renewed. His agent stopped returning calls. He tried to find other work. He was a skilled mechanic, and he took jobs where he could. But the Depression had made competition brutal, and every employer wanted to know why a man who had recently been earning $1,500 a week was applying to fix carburetors. He sold his house. He moved into a small apartment. His wife left him. He borrowed money from friends until the friends stopped answering. In 1934, in a moment that Hollywood historians still find almost unbearable to describe, Carl Dane set up a hot dog cart on the sidewalk outside the gates of MGM, the very studio where he had been a star 5 years earlier. He sold hot dogs to the extras and the grips who walked past him on their way to work. On the 14th of April, 1934, Carl Dane sat down at a small table in his rented room on North Sycamore Avenue. He spread out a scrapbook of his old MGM publicity photographs. He arranged them carefully, the way a man might arrange a proof of his own existence. And then he took a revolver from a drawer and ended his life. He was 47 years old. He had no family left in America. His body sat in the county morgue for several days because there was no one to claim it. When the Danish community in Los Angeles learned what had happened, they were outraged. They demanded that MGM pay for a proper funeral. The studio, to its modest credit, agreed. Carl Dane was buried here at Hollywood Forever in a service attended by fewer than 20 people, most of them Danish immigrants, who had never met him in life. His grave is in the Abbey of the Psalms, a plain plaque, no dates of stardom, no mention of the big parade. If you visit today, you'll find it almost by accident. That's the thing about being forgotten. It happens twice. Once while you're still alive, and once in the way you are buried. Just a short walk through Hollywood Forever brings us to another grave that tells a similar story with a very different ending. This one belongs to a woman whose name once appeared above the title on Broadway marquees, whose face was on the cover of Life magazine, and who died in a rooming house on the wrong side of town with almost nothing to her name. Alma Rubens was born in San Francisco in 1897. She was strikingly beautiful in the way that translated perfectly to silent film, dark-eyed, soulful, with a mouth that could suggest tragedy without saying a word. D.W. Griffith cast her in Intolerance in 1916, when she was 19. She worked steadily through the silent era in more than 40 films, playing leads opposite Rudolph Valentino in The Rejected Woman and starring in the 1929 Showboat. She married 3 times, including once to the actor Ricardo Cortez. She earned enormous money and spent it faster than she earned it. And somewhere along the way, probably in the mid-1920s, someone gave Alma Rubens her first shot of heroin. The addiction moved fast. By 1929, she was being hospitalized regularly. The studios covered it up as long as they could. When she was found wandering the streets of Los Angeles in a nightgown in January 1929, the papers were told it was exhaustion. When she attacked a doctor with a knife at a private sanitarium later that year, it was reported as a nervous breakdown. She was committed to a state hospital, released, committed again. Her contracts were quietly voided. The friends she had once entertained lavishly stopped inviting her anywhere. By 1930, she was 33 years old and unemployable. She published a series of confessional articles about her addiction, hoping to earn some money and warn other young women away from the same fate. The articles were reprinted in newspapers across the country. She was briefly famous again, but for the wrong reasons, and the offers of film work did not come. On the 21st of January 1931, Alma Rubens was arrested in San Diego for possession of morphine. She was released on bail. She traveled back to Los Angeles. She checked into a small hotel and then, when she could no longer afford even that, moved into a rooming house. On January 22nd, less than 24 hours after her arrest, she died of pneumonia, complicated by her long addiction. She was 33 years old. Her mother arranged the funeral. Almost no one from the film industry attended. She is buried here at Hollywood Forever under a plain marker that gives her name and the dates of her life, nothing more. There is no mention that she once co-starred with Valentino, that she once played Magnolia in Showboat, that her face was once one of the most recognized in America. There is only the name, and the years, and the silence. From Hollywood Forever, we travel across town and into the working-class flats of East Los Angeles to Calvary Cemetery, the old Catholic cemetery that has held Los Angeles's Catholic dead since 1896. Ramon Navarro is buried here. John Barrymore was buried here for a while, before his family moved him. And in a modest plot lies a woman whose face, if you had lived in America in 1924, you would have recognized instantly. Her name was Marie Prevost. She was born Mary Bickford Dunn in Sarnia, Ontario, in 1896. She came to Hollywood as a teenager and was hired by Mack Sennett as one of his bathing beauties, the pretty young women who cavorted in one-piece bathing suits in Sennett's comedies. She was funny in a way that most of the bathing beauties weren't. She had timing. She had a face that could go from flirtation to bewilderment in a single frame. Ernst Lubitsch spotted her, took her seriously as a comedian, and directed her in 3 sophisticated comedies in the mid-1920s that made her a genuine star. By 1927, Marie Prevost was earning $1,500 a week at Warner Brothers. She was on the covers of Photoplay and Motion Picture. She was married to another actor, Kenneth Harlan. She had a house, a car, and a small dog she adored, a dachshund named Maxie. Then everything came apart at once. Sound arrived. And while her voice was fine, the parts she got were smaller. Her mother, to whom she was devoted, was killed in an automobile accident in 1926 that Marie survived. Her marriage collapsed. She began to drink. She gained weight, and the studios that had cast her in slim comedic roles stopped casting her at all. By 1931, she was doing bit parts. By 1935, she was doing extra work when she could get it. She had also, in a desperate attempt to lose weight and win back parts, put herself on a starvation diet combined with heavy drinking. Doctors told her she was destroying her body. She kept doing it. On the 21st of January 1937, a neighbor in her small apartment on Cahuenga Boulevard called the manager to complain about a dog barking non-stop. When the manager entered Marie Prevost's apartment, he found her dead in bed and Maxie, the little dachshund, standing beside her. She had been dead for at least 2 days. She was 38 years old. The cause of death was acute alcoholism and severe malnutrition. She weighed less than 100 pounds. In her purse, the police found $300, uncashed checks totaling several thousand more, and an unpaid bill from her landlord. Her funeral was paid for by Joan Crawford, who had known her from the Senate days and who was reportedly horrified when she learned of the circumstances. Wallace Beery, Barbara Stanwyck, and Clark Gable contributed to the costs as well. Marie Prevost is buried here at Calvary Cemetery in a plot marked only by a small flat stone. The dog, Maxie, was taken in by a friend and lived for years afterward. There is a persistent Hollywood myth that Maxie ate part of Marie Prevost's body. It isn't true. The dog had been trying to wake her. That was all. The songwriter Nick Lowe wrote a song about her in 1977, a bitter, jaunty tune called Marie Provost, spelled with an O. Most people who hear it don't know it's about a real person. She was forgotten so completely that by the time she became a punchline, no one even bothered to spell her name right. Let us travel now up the coast, past the beaches, into the older part of the city, and stop at Angelus Rosedale Cemetery on West Washington Boulevard. This is one of the oldest cemeteries in Los Angeles, opened in 1884, and it holds the bones of many of the people who built the city. And in one section, in a grave that was unmarked for more than 4 decades, lies a woman who was once one of the most famous character actresses in the movies. Hattie McDaniel was born in Wichita, Kansas in 1893, the youngest of 13 children. Her parents had been enslaved. Her father, Henry McDaniel, was a Baptist minister and a Civil War veteran who had served with the 122nd United States Colored Troops. Her mother, Susan, was a gospel singer. Hattie followed her into music, and by her teens was performing on the vaudeville circuit as a blues singer and comedienne. She had one of the great singing voices of her generation, warm and rolling, and she made her first radio broadcast in 1915, which some sources believe made her one of the first black women ever to sing on American radio. She came to Hollywood in the early 1930s and took whatever work she could find, which in that era, for a black woman, meant playing maids. She played maids in more than 80 films. She played them with dignity, with humor, with a razor-sharp comic timing that made her scenes come alive. And in 1939, David O. Selznick cast her as Mammy in Gone with the Wind. Hattie McDaniel won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress for that performance. She was the first African-American ever to win an Oscar. At the ceremony at the Ambassador Hotel in 1940, she was seated at a segregated table at the back of the room. Selznick had to obtain special permission to have her admitted to the hotel at all. When her name was called, she walked to the stage and delivered a speech that ended, "I sincerely hope I shall always be a credit to my race and to the motion picture industry." And then, slowly, over the next 15 years, Hollywood forgot her. The parts got smaller. The NAACP publicly criticized her for continuing to play maids, though the truth was that Hollywood offered her nothing else. She moved to radio, where she starred as Beulah, a black maid on a popular series, and drew significant criticism for that too. She was caught between an industry that would only cast her as domestic help and a community that resented her for taking the work. It was an impossible position, and she carried it with as much grace as anyone could. By the early 1950s, her health was failing. She had breast cancer. She was also nearly broke, having supported extended family for years, and the treatment was ruining what savings she had left. She moved into a smaller house, then into a boarding house for actresses run by the Motion Picture and Television Fund. Hattie McDaniel died there on the 26th of October, 1952. She was 59 years old. In her will, she had asked to be buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, which was then called Hollywood Memorial Park. The cemetery, which was whites only at the time, refused. Her family buried her here instead, at Angelus Rosedale, and for reasons that were probably financial, her grave went unmarked for 47 years. In 1999, Hollywood Forever's new owners offered to move her remains to a place of honor in their cemetery. Her family declined. She was where she was. Instead, the cemetery paid for a proper monument to be installed here at Rosedale, a large pink granite marker with a bronze plaque that lists her Oscar and the words, "Aunt Hattie. You are a credit to your craft, your race, and your family." The first African American ever to win an Academy Award lay in an unmarked grave for nearly half a century. That is what forgetting looks like. We travel now north through the city and up into the San Fernando Valley, to Valhalla Memorial Park in North Hollywood. This cemetery was founded in 1923 and includes a striking Portal of the Folded Wings, a domed monument that holds the ashes of aviation pioneers. Amelia Earhart has a memorial here, though her body was never found. And in a modest plot, beneath a simple flat marker, lies one of the most gifted comediennes of the silent era. Mabel Normand was born in New Brighton, Staten Island, in 1892 or 1893. She began modeling at 14 for the illustrator Charles Dana Gibson, whose Gibson Girls defined American beauty at the turn of the century. She drifted into film work by accident and turned out to be a natural. She had the loveliest comic timing of anyone in the early movies. She was directing her own films by 1914, at the age of 22, which made her one of the first female directors in American cinema. She discovered Charlie Chaplin. She partnered with Fatty Arbuckle. She was engaged, on and off, to Mack Sennett himself. Between 1911 and 1923, she appeared in more than 200 films. And then in 1922, her friend, the director William Desmond Taylor, was murdered in his Los Angeles bungalow. Mabel Normand had been the last person known to have seen him alive. She was never accused of the crime, but the press coverage was merciless. She was one of two actresses whose careers were destroyed by association with the Taylor murder, the other being Mary Miles Minter. The case was never solved. Then, in 1924, Mabel Normand's chauffeur shot a millionaire oil broker with her pistol during a party at the broker's home. She was not present, but the pistol was hers. The scandal broke what remained of her career. Producers who had loved her stopped calling. Her films were pulled from theaters in several states. She was 32 years old, and she was radioactive. She also had tuberculosis, which she had probably contracted years earlier. The stress accelerated it. By 1929, she was in and out of sanatoriums. She married the actor Lou Cody in a spontaneous ceremony in 1926, though the two of them lived separately for most of their marriage. He remained loyal to her, visited her in the sanatoriums, and paid her bills when she could no longer pay them herself. Mabel Normand died at the Pottinger Sanatorium in Monrovia, California, on the 23rd of February 1930, of pulmonary tuberculosis. She was 37 years old. Her funeral was well attended, unusually so for a fallen star of the period. Chaplin came. Sennett came. Marion Davies came. But within a few years, her name had faded from Hollywood memory almost entirely. The comedies she had made were considered old-fashioned. The scandals were remembered longer than the films. Her grave here at Valhalla is a small, flat stone. Mabel Normand Cody, 1892 to 1930. Nothing about the more than 200 films. Nothing about the fact that she directed Chaplin. Nothing about the fact that she was, in the assessment of many silent film historians, the funniest woman in the movies before anyone else even knew a woman could be funny. We travel now across the continent, to a small town in the mountains of western North Carolina. Asheville was, in the early 20th century, one of the great American resort towns, a place where the wealthy came for the mountain air and the tuberculars came for the sanatoriums. F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife Zelda spent time here. Thomas Wolfe grew up here. And in Riverside Cemetery, on a green hillside above the French Broad River, lies a man whose face millions of Americans knew from more than 200 films, but whose name almost no one could tell you today. His name was Guy Kibbe, and if you have ever seen 42nd Street, or Gold Diggers of 1933, or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, you have seen him. He was the bald, jowly, warm-eyed character actor who played bumbling businessmen, corrupt politicians, harried fathers, and befuddled husbands throughout the 1930s. He was a working actor of the highest order, and Warner Brothers used him in nearly everything. Guy Kibbe was born in El Paso, Texas, in 1882. He was on stage by the time he was 13, playing juvenile roles in traveling companies. He worked for more than 30 years in the theater before he ever made a film. When he finally arrived in Hollywood in 1930, at the age of 48, he was already a seasoned professional, And he worked constantly for the next 15 years, appearing in as many as 10 pictures a year at his peak. He was never a star. He knew he was never going to be a star. He was the man who made the stars look better by being reliably wonderful in every scene he shared with them. He played the theater producer Abner Dillon in 42nd Street. He played Silas Ragsdale, the crooked banker, in Babbitt. He played Uncle Willie in the Our Gang comedies. Frank Capra loved him and cast him repeatedly. James Cagney, W.C. Fields, Barbara Stanwyck, all of them worked with Guy Kibbe, and all of them said on the record that he was one of the most professional and kind-hearted men in the business. By 1949, he had retired. He was 67. He had made his money, and he wanted to live quietly. He moved with his wife to a farm outside East Hampton, New York, and spent his time gardening and reading. He had begun to suffer, in his early 60s, from Parkinson's disease. It progressed slowly at first, then faster. By 1955, he could no longer feed himself. His wife had died in 1951. His children had their own lives. He was moved to a small nursing home in East Hampton where the staff knew him only as a pleasant elderly man who had once been in the movies. Guy Kibbe died there on the 24th of May, 1956, of Parkinson's disease. He was 74. His body was brought back to Asheville, where he had lived for a time as a young man and where he had asked to be buried. The funeral was small. Almost no one from Hollywood attended, because almost no one from Hollywood remembered him. His grave here, at Riverside Cemetery, is a modest headstone. It gives his name and his dates. It does not mention the 200 films. It does not mention that he was, in the estimation of James Cagney, the best character man in the business, bar none. He was one of those actors whose face you know absolutely, and whose name you probably never learned. And that, in Hollywood, is its own particular way of being forgotten. Let us move on now to another kind of oblivion. We travel south to Mount Sinai Memorial Park in the Hollywood Hills, and we stop at the grave of a woman who was, for one strange and dreamlike year, promoted as the successor to Marilyn Monroe. Her name was Barbara Payton. She was born Barbara Lee Redfield in Cloquet, Minnesota, in 1927. She had one of those faces that photographed like an accident of light, blonde, wide-eyed, impossibly cheekboned. She married her high school sweetheart at 16, divorced him, married again at 18, and drove to Hollywood in 1948 with $30 in her pocket. Within a year, she had a contract at Universal. Her rise was astonishing. She was cast opposite James Cagney in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye in 1950, and she held her own with him, which was not a small thing. She was cast opposite Gary Cooper in Dallas the same year. Warner Brothers signed her to a long contract. Life magazine put her on the cover. She was, for a period of about 18 months in 1950 and 1951, one of the most talked about young actresses in Hollywood. She was also drinking heavily, sleeping with everyone she wanted to, and living her private life in a way that the studios of the early 1950s could not tolerate for long. In 1951, she became engaged to the actor Franchot Tone. She was simultaneously seeing another actor, Tom Neal. On the 14th of September 1951, at Barbara Payton's home in Hollywood, Tom Neal beat Franchot Tone nearly to death with his fists. Tone was hospitalized for 18 days with a broken nose, a concussion, and a fractured cheekbone. The story ran on the front page of every paper in America. Barbara Payton married Franchot Tone anyway, in the hospital. The marriage lasted 53 days. She returned to Tom Neal, then left him. Her career at 24 was over. The studios would not touch her. She got a few parts in Poverty Row pictures. By 1955, she was doing exploitation films in England. By 1958, she was not working at all. What happened over the next 9 years is one of the most brutal downfalls in Hollywood history. Barbara Payton drank herself out of every apartment she rented. She was arrested for prostitution on Sunset Boulevard in 1963. She was arrested for public drunkenness so many times that the LAPD had a file on her half an inch thick. She wrote a memoir in 1963 called I Am Not Ashamed, dictated to a ghostwriter in a series of drunken sessions, and it is one of the most heartbreaking documents ever produced by a fallen Hollywood star. She described her life on the street, the men who paid her, the drinks she took, All of it in a matter-of-fact tone that reads now like someone narrating her own drowning. Her parents, who lived in San Diego, eventually took her in. Her father was a stern man who had never approved of her career. She lived in their small house in her final years, drying out, relapsing, drying out again. On the 8th of May, 1967, Barbara Payton died in her parents' home of heart and liver failure. She was 39 years old. Her parents buried her here at Mount Sinai. There was no funeral. There were no notices in the trade papers. She had been out of the industry for so long that most of the people who had known her at her brief peak assumed she had died years earlier. The grave is a flat marker. It gives her name and her dates. If you did not know who she was, you would never guess that a decade before her death, she had been on the cover of Life magazine, being called the next Marilyn Monroe. Now we come to a story so painful that even people who know a great deal about Hollywood sometimes find it difficult to speak about. We travel to Eternal Hills Memorial Park in Oceanside, California, a coastal cemetery an hour south of Los Angeles. The grave we are visiting was, for some years after his death, unmarked. He was buried under a name that was not the one his fans had known him by. Bobby Driscoll was born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in 1937. He was, by every measure, one of the most naturally gifted child actors in the history of American film. He was discovered at 5 years old in a barber shop. He was signed by MGM. Within 2 years, he was working steadily. By 8, he had signed with Walt Disney personally. He was Jim Hawkins in Disney's Treasure Island in 1950. He was the voice and physical model for Peter Pan in Disney's 1953 animated film, the studio's live-action reference for every gesture the character made. He starred in Song of the South. He starred in So Dear to My Heart. In 1949, at the age of 12, he received a Juvenile Academy Award for his performance in The Window, a film noir in which he played a boy who witnesses a murder and whom no one believes. It was an astonishing performance for a child. It remains a masterclass in what a young actor can do when given real material. And then he became a teenager, and Walt Disney let him go. His face changed. His voice broke. He developed acne so severe that the studio's makeup department could not conceal it on film. Disney canceled his contract in 1953. Bobby Driscoll was 16 years old. He had been a movie star since he was 5, and he was suddenly nobody. He tried to keep working. He got a few television parts. His parents transferred him from a professional children's school to a regular public high school in Los Angeles. And the students there beat him up because he had been in the movies. He turned to drugs to cope. He was arrested for possession of narcotics in 1956. He was arrested again in 1959. In 1961, at the age of 24, he was sentenced to the Narcotic Rehabilitation Center at Chino, a state prison hospital, where he served 8 months. When he got out, he could not find work in Hollywood. His name was Poison. He moved to New York City in 1965 and drifted into the Andy Warhol factory scene, where he did some experimental film work with Warhol's crowd. He was living in flop houses on the Lower East Side. He was addicted to heroin. He was 30 years old, and he looked 50. On the 30th of March, 1968, 2 children playing in an abandoned tenement on East 10th Street in the East Village found the body of a man on a filthy cot. He had died of heart failure brought on by long-term drug abuse. He had no identification on him. The police photographed him, fingerprinted him, and, when no one came forward to claim him, buried him in an unmarked grave in the Potter's Field on Hart Island, off the coast of the Bronx. This is where New York City buries its unclaimed dead. More than a year later, in November 1969, Bobby Driscoll's mother, still living in California, tried to find her son. She contacted the Los Angeles police, who contacted the New York police, who ran the fingerprints from the man in the tenement. The match came back. Bobby Driscoll had been dead for 19 months. His body was, by then, impossible to recover from Hart Island. His mother had a memorial plaque installed at Eternal Hills Memorial Park in Oceanside, next to his father's grave. The plaque bears his name and his dates. His body is not there. His body is still on Hart Island, in a mass grave with the other unclaimed dead of New York City, buried among strangers who had no names either. The boy who had been Peter Pan died alone in a condemned building, and Hollywood did not notice for a year and a half. We travel now to a very different kind of grave. One that is grand and prominent and impossible to miss. But that belongs to a woman whose final decade was one of the loneliest on record. Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale is enormous. More than 300 acres of manicured lawns and reproduction European art. In the Great Mausoleum, in the Sanctuary of Trust, rests Frances Farmer. Except she doesn't rest there. That is the strange thing. Frances Farmer's family placed a memorial plaque there, but her actual remains are buried in Indianapolis, Indiana, at Oak Lawn Memorial Gardens, in a plot alongside her mother. This is where we are going. Frances Farmer was born in Seattle, Washington, in 1913. She was staggeringly intelligent. She won a national essay contest in high school with a piece titled "God Dies," which caused a small national scandal. She won a scholarship to the University of Washington, where she studied journalism and drama. She won a trip to the Soviet Union in 1935 by selling subscriptions to a communist newspaper, which caused a larger scandal. She was, from the beginning, a woman who did not seem to understand that Hollywood in the 1930s was not the place for a woman of her particular temperament. Paramount signed her in 1935. She was cast opposite Bing Crosby in Rhythm on the Range. She was cast in Come and Get It in 1936, in a dual role, and she was electrifying. The critics agreed she was one of the finest young actresses in Hollywood. Clifford Odets brought her to New York to star on Broadway in Golden Boy for the Group Theater. She had an affair with him. She had affairs with several others. She drank. She argued with her studio. She was, by 1940, considered impossible to work with, which in Hollywood terms meant that a woman had opinions. She was arrested in October 1942 for driving with her headlights on in a wartime blackout zone. She was fined and released. In January 1943, she was arrested again on a probation violation stemming from the earlier arrest. She fought the arresting officer. She was dragged into court in a sweater and slacks with her hair uncombed, and she made a spectacle of her contempt for the proceedings. The papers loved it. The judge sentenced her to 180 days. Her mother committed her, from that jail sentence, to a psychiatric hospital. This is where the real tragedy begins. Frances Farmer spent most of the next 8 years in state mental institutions, primarily Western State Hospital in Steilacoom, Washington. She was subjected, by every credible account, to horrifying treatments, including insulin shock therapy and electroconvulsive therapy. A myth has persisted for decades that she was also subjected to a lobotomy. The evidence does not support this, and her family has always denied it. But the fact that the story is even plausible tells you something about what her treatment must have been like. She was released in 1950. She was 36 years old, and she was a ghost. She tried to make a comeback. She got a few small parts in television. She hosted a movie program on a Indianapolis television station for a few years in the late 1950s, introducing old films that had been made when she was young. She married 3 times. She drank heavily. She lived in a small apartment in Indianapolis, alone at the end. Frances Farmer died of esophageal cancer on the 1st of August 1970 in Indianapolis. She was 56 years old. She had been out of the movies for 30 years. Her funeral was attended by a handful of local friends and one former co-star, Loretta Young, who had known her briefly at Paramount and who quietly paid for the flowers. She is buried at Oak Lawn Memorial Gardens in Indianapolis, in a plot that was unmarked for many years. A small headstone was eventually added. The memorial plaque at Forest Lawn in Glendale, which has her name and her dates, does not indicate that her actual remains are 2,000 miles to the east, in a cemetery that most Hollywood fans will never visit. She was one of the most gifted actresses of her generation, and Hollywood destroyed her, and then it forgot her, and then it built her a plaque in a mausoleum that does not contain her body. It is difficult to think of a more perfect metaphor for what the industry does to the people it uses up. Let us travel now to another cemetery in the San Fernando Valley, this one called Chapel of the Pines Crematory, on Santa Monica Boulevard in Los Angeles. The building is a plain white stucco structure that most people drive past without noticing. Inside, in a modest niche in the columbarium, rests the ashes of a woman who was, at 22, the most photographed peekaboo blonde in the world. Veronica Lake was born Constance Aukelman in Brooklyn, New York, in 1922. Her father died in an oil refinery explosion when she was 10. Her mother remarried and moved the family to Florida, then to California. Constance drifted into extra work in Hollywood at 15. She was signed by Paramount at 19 and given a screen test in which her long blonde hair fell over one eye during a take. The studio's producer decided this was the look. She was renamed Veronica Lake. Within a year, she was one of the most imitated women in America. She starred opposite Alan Ladd in This Gun for Hire, The Glass Key, and The Blue Dahlia. Her partnership with Ladd was one of the most electric in film noir. He was short, she was shorter. They matched perfectly on screen, cool and dangerous and beautiful. She played the female lead in Preston Sturges's Sullivan's Travels, which many critics consider one of the finest American comedies ever made. She was, in the years 1941 to 1946, one of the top box office attractions in Hollywood. During the war, the government asked her to change her hairstyle. Women working in factories were catching their peekaboo hair in machinery in imitation of Veronica Lake, and it was causing injuries. She did it. She pinned her hair back. The public relations photos of her new, severe style were circulated widely. She was, briefly, the face of wartime female responsibility. And then Paramount let her contract lapse in 1948. She was 26 years old. She had drunk too much, argued with too many directors, and slept with the wrong people, and the studio was done with her. She tried to work. She did some television in the early 1950s. She did some summer stock. She married 3 times. She had 4 children, one of whom died in infancy. By 1960, she was broke. In 1962, a reporter for the New York Post found her working as a barmaid at the Martha Washington Hotel in Manhattan, a residence hotel for women. She was making $35 a week. The story ran, and it became a sensation. Marlon Brando reportedly sent her money. She refused it. She kept working as a barmaid. She wrote an autobiography in 1969 that was widely praised for its honesty. She moved to England for a period, then to Ireland, then to Florida. She had cirrhosis of the liver by the mid-1960s and hepatitis by the early 1970s. Veronica Lake died at Vermont Medical Center in Burlington, Vermont, on the 7th of July, 1973. She was 50 years old. She died of hepatitis and acute renal failure. There were 2 of her children present. She had asked in her will to be cremated and to have her ashes scattered off the coast of the Virgin Islands, where she had once been happy. Her son took a portion of the ashes there and did as she asked. The remainder was placed in a niche at Chapel of the Pines in Los Angeles, in a section of the columbarium that is not open to the general public. For decades, most fans who tried to visit her ashes were told that no such record existed. This was a mistake or a deliberate protection. No one is quite sure which. Her ashes were quietly there the whole time. In 2004, a great-grandson she had never met came to claim what remained of her ashes and scattered them at sea. There is nothing at Chapel of the Pines now. The blonde, who had once been the most photographed woman in America, has no marker anywhere on the North American continent. She is only in the water. We travel now to another cemetery in Los Angeles County. This one in Culver City. Holy Cross Cemetery is one of the great Catholic cemeteries of the region. Bing Crosby is buried here. Rita Hayworth is buried here. Charles Boyer is buried here. And in a modest plot in the older section rests a woman whose face may be the most beautiful ever captured on film, and whose final years were among the most heartbreaking. Gail Russell was born in Chicago in 1924. Her family moved to Los Angeles in her teens, and a talent scout spotted her at Santa Monica High School. She had no interest in acting. She was painfully, cripplingly shy. Paramount signed her at 18 anyway, because she was extraordinarily beautiful in a way that only came along every few years. Her eyes were the size of $50 and the color of a swimming pool at dusk. The cameras loved her in a way that seemed almost embarrassing. She was cast in The Uninvited in 1944, a gothic ghost story that made her a star. She was cast opposite John Wayne in Angel and the Bad Man in 1947, and she was luminous in it. She was cast opposite Wayne again, in Wake of the Red Witch, in 1948. Wayne, who was rarely effusive about his co-stars, said that Gail Russell had more natural presence on camera than almost anyone he had ever worked with. She was also, from her very first day on a soundstage, an alcoholic. It had started when she was a teenager, before Paramount signed her, as a way to manage the anxiety that made public appearances physically unbearable for her. The studio, knowing what they had, arranged for a doctor to give her something for her nerves before scenes. This is a familiar story in old Hollywood. It rarely ends well. She married the actor Guy Madison in 1949. The marriage lasted 5 years. She was in and out of sanatoriums by the mid-1950s. In 1953, she drove her car through the plate glass window of a Los Angeles cafe while heavily intoxicated. She was 28. Her career was, by that point, essentially over. She did occasional television work. She was arrested for drunk driving multiple times. She lived alone in a small apartment on Adelaide Drive in Santa Monica. On the 26th of August, 1961, a neighbor called the police when she noticed that Gail Russell's morning newspaper had not been picked up for several days. The police entered the apartment and found her body on the floor of the living room. She had been dead for at least 4 days. She was surrounded by empty vodka bottles. She was 36 years old. The coroner ruled it a heart attack complicated by chronic alcoholism. There was no note, no farewell, no arrangement of things. She had simply been drinking, and then she had died, and then she had lain there for 4 days, while the rest of the world went about its business. Her grave here at Holy Cross is unmarked by any monument. Her family placed a small flat plaque with only her name and her dates. There is no mention of the films, no mention of the fact that she was, in the estimation of many who worked with her, one of the most naturally photogenic actresses of the 1940s. There is only the name and the years and the terrible arithmetic of them. She was 36. 4 days. It is one of the loneliest deaths in the story of Hollywood. We travel now to a very different final resting place. We are going to Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, about 30 miles north of Manhattan. Judy Garland was buried here for many years before being moved to Hollywood forever. Malcolm X is buried here. Ed Sullivan is buried here. And in a modest crypt in the Rosewood Mausoleum lies a woman who had been, at 15, considered one of the most promising young actresses in America, and who by 25 had been forgotten so completely that when she died, several of the papers that ran her obituary got her age wrong by nearly a decade. Her name was Susan Peters. She was born Suzanne Carnahan in Spokane, Washington, in 1921. Her father died in a car accident when she was 5. Her mother moved the family to Los Angeles, and Susan attended Hollywood High School with a young Alexis Smith and Nanette Fabre. She began working in bit parts in 1939. Warner Brothers signed her, dropped her, and MGM picked her up in 1942. She was renamed Susan Peters, and she was cast that year in Random Harvest opposite Ronald Coleman and Greer Garson. Random Harvest was one of the biggest hits of 1942. Susan Peters, in a supporting role as a young woman in love with a man who cannot remember his past, received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. She was 21 years old. She lost to Teresa Wright, but the industry was on notice. MGM began building her up as a major star. She was cast in Song of Russia. She was cast in Keep Your Powder Dry. She married the actor Richard Quine in 1943. Everything was in front of her. On New Year's Day, 1945, Susan Peters and her husband were duck hunting near Cottonwood, California. She reached for a shotgun in the back of a truck. The gun discharged accidentally. The bullet lodged in her spine. She was paralyzed from the waist down. She was 23 years old. MGM did everything a studio in 1945 knew how to do, which was not enough. They developed a picture specifically for her called The Sign of the Ram, in which she played a paraplegic woman confined to a wheelchair. The film was released in 1948. It did not do well. There simply were no other parts for her. Wheelchair roles for young actresses did not exist in Hollywood, and Susan Peters was not going to be cast in anything else. She and Richard Quine adopted a son. The marriage collapsed under the strain of her injury and her depression in 1948. She tried to keep working. She did a television series in 1951 called Miss Susan, in which she played a wheelchair-using lawyer in Ohio. The show ran for 39 episodes and was canceled. By 1952, Susan Peters had essentially stopped eating. She was severely depressed. She refused most food and would drink only small amounts of liquid. She was hospitalized repeatedly. On the 23rd of October 1952, at the age of 31, Susan Peters died at her home in Visalia, California, of bronchial pneumonia, complicated by chronic kidney infection and severe malnutrition. She weighed less than 90 pounds. It was, in the view of the doctors who attended her, a slow starvation by choice. She had simply stopped wanting to live. She was buried at Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, in a crypt her family had purchased. The New York Times ran an obituary of 3 paragraphs. The Los Angeles Times ran a longer one, but got several of the details wrong. She had been, 10 years earlier, on the cusp of major stardom. She had been nominated for an Academy Award, and she died at 31, alone in a small California town, of a hunger she had chosen. Let us pause and take a longer walk now. We travel across the country to New York City, to a cemetery in Queens called Cypress Hills Cemetery, which straddles the Brooklyn-Queens border. It is one of the great old cemeteries of the city, founded in 1848. Mae West is buried here. Jackie Robinson is buried here. And in a modest plot lies a woman who was, in 1926, one of the highest-paid actresses in the world, and who died in a rooming house in Manhattan in 1938 with $500 to her name. Her name was Mae Murray. She was born Marie Adrienne Koenig in Portsmouth, Virginia, in 1885. She had begun as a dancer in the Ziegfeld Follies in New York, and she was one of the top attractions of the Follies for several years. Her physical grace and her impossibly wide mouth, which she painted into what became known as the bee-stung lips look, made her one of the most imitated women of the 1910s. Every fan magazine ran instructions for how to paint your mouth like Mae Murray. She came to Hollywood in 1916 and made a string of successful silent pictures. But her greatest moment came in 1925, when Erich von Stroheim directed her in The Merry Widow. The film was a sensation. She was paid $10,000 a week, an unimaginable salary in 1925. She married Prince David Mdivani, a Georgian nobleman of dubious legitimacy, and became Princess Mae Mdivani. The wedding was covered in every paper in America. She and the prince entertained lavishly, spent freely, and made unwise investments. The marriage lasted 7 years. During those 7 years, Prince Mdivani, who had been given control of Mae Murray's finances, systematically drained them. When she divorced him in 1933, she was nearly broke. When she tried to return to films, she found that sound had come to Hollywood, that her particular style of silent film acting was no longer wanted, and that no studio would sign her. She was 48. She was considered a relic. She moved to New York and tried to teach dance, but her students were few. She wrote a series of ghost-written memoirs that sold poorly. She lived in progressively cheaper hotels through the mid-1930s. By 1935, she was in a rooming house on West 72nd Street. Her son, Koran, whom she had adopted with the prince, had been taken by her ex-husband's family, and she had lost custody. She was, by every account of those who knew her in this period, dignified in her poverty and completely alone. In August 1938, Mae Murray was found wandering in Central Park by police, disoriented and unable to remember her own address. She was taken to Bellevue Hospital for observation. When the papers picked up the story, the response was extraordinary. Mary Pickford paid her hospital bills. A collection was taken up among the older stars, who remembered her. She was released and given a small apartment. But the wandering incident had broken something in her. She lived quietly for another 25 years, in various small apartments, on the charity of old friends. She rarely gave interviews. She died in a nursing home in Los Angeles on the 23rd of March, 1965. She was 79 years old. Her funeral was attended by fewer than a dozen people. Her body was returned to New York and buried at Cypress Hills. She had earned, in the peak year of her career, more than $1 million in modern currency. She died with $500 in a nursing home bank account, and no one from the studios that had made her fortune sent a wreath. We travel now to Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles, the same cemetery where Marie Prevost lies. In a modest plot rests a man who was, for the audiences of the early 1930s, one of the funniest and strangest comic performers ever to appear on screen. Ted Healy was born Charles Ernest Lee Nash. in Kaufman, Texas, in 1896. He grew up in vaudeville, and by his 20s was one of the top-billed comics in the country. He had an act that combined rapid-fire monologues with physical comedy involving a trio of stooges, three men who played his hapless assistants and whom he slapped, insulted, and abused for laughs. Those three men were Mo Howard, Larry Fine, and, at various times, Shemp Howard or Curly Howard. The Three Stooges, as they eventually became known, worked for Ted Healy for years before they went out on their own. Ted Healy came to Hollywood in the early 1930s and appeared in more than 30 films, mostly for MGM. He was a supporting player in Bombshell with Jean Harlow. He was in Reckless. He was in San Francisco. He was reliably funny, and the studios used him constantly, but he never quite became a star in his own right. His three former assistants, meanwhile, had signed with Columbia Pictures and were becoming enormously popular. This did not sit well with him. Ted Healy drank. He drank prodigiously and belligerently, and he was not a pleasant drunk. He had a history of fistfights in Hollywood restaurants going back years. On the night of the 20th of December 1937, Ted Healy went out drinking to celebrate the birth of his son. He hit several nightclubs. At the Trocadero on Sunset Boulevard, according to the reports that came out later, he got into a physical altercation with several men. He was beaten badly. He made his way home to his apartment, or was brought there, and by the following morning he was dead. He was 41 years old. The official cause of death, initially, was acute alcoholism combined with a heart attack. But rumors circulated almost immediately that Ted Healy had been beaten to death by men connected to organized crime or by other Hollywood figures. The MGM publicity department, according to industry lore, worked overnight to cover up the truth. Whatever the truth was, no one has ever definitively established it. His funeral was small. His three former stooges did not attend. They had, by 1937, publicly severed all ties with him after years of arguments over money and credit, and their absence at the funeral was one of the more remarked-upon details in the papers. Ted Healy is buried here at Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles, in the same cemetery as Marie Prevost. His grave is a small marker. No mention of vaudeville, no mention of the Stooges, no mention of the 30 films. He had been at the center of American comedy in the early 1930s. He died in a way that Hollywood still argues about. And his three former assistants, whom he had discovered and trained, went on to become internationally famous for the next 40 years, while Ted Healy became a footnote. We travel now to a different sort of cemetery. Woodland Cemetery in Dayton, Ohio, is a beautiful old rural cemetery founded in 1841. The Wright brothers are buried here. The poet Paul Laurence Dunbar is buried here. And in a family plot rests a woman whose life reads like one of the fictions of the era she came from. Rita Jolivet was born in London in 1889. She was an actress on the Broadway stage before she was 20, appearing opposite the great English actor Cyril Maude. She played opposite Sarah Bernhardt in one production. She was, briefly, one of the most acclaimed young actresses in New York. In May 1915, Rita Jolivet boarded the Lusitania in New York, bound for England. She was 26. She was traveling to visit her mother and to appear in a benefit performance. The Lusitania was torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland on May 7th. Nearly 1,200 people died. Rita Jolivet survived. She spent hours in the freezing water and was pulled out by a lifeboat. She lost her brother-in-law, the theatrical producer George Vernon, who had been traveling with her. She never quite recovered from the experience. She continued to act, in silent films in Italy and in a few American productions, but her heart was not in it. She lectured about the sinking. She testified in inquiries. She wrote about it. Her career slowly wound down through the 1920s. She married an Italian nobleman and lived in Europe for many years. When the Second World War came, she was interned as an enemy alien in a camp in the Italian Alps for the duration of the war. She emerged in 1945 with almost nothing. Her husband had died. Her savings had been confiscated. She was 56 years old, and she was starting over. She came to America in the late 1940s to be near her family, who had settled in Dayton, Ohio, of all places, because a distant cousin had a home there. She lived out her final years in a small house near her relatives, in a city she had never expected to live in, thousands of miles from any of the stages she had once graced. Rita Jolivet died in Dayton, Ohio, on the 2nd of March, 1971. She was 82 years old. She had been one of only a handful of Lusitania survivors still living at the time of her death. Her obituary in the local paper ran to 3 sentences. It did not mention Bernhardt. It did not mention her Broadway career. It mentioned only that she had once been on a ship that sank. She is buried here at Woodland Cemetery, in a family plot beside cousins she had barely known. There is no marker to indicate the strange arc of her life, no mention of what she had been in another century, in another world. She had crossed the Atlantic in the most famous shipwreck of the age, and she had come to rest in Dayton, and Dayton was not sure quite what to do with her. Let us head south now, into the humidity and dust of a Texas summer, to Mount Olivet Cemetery, in Fort Worth. This is a modest municipal cemetery. Among the plain markers is one for a woman who had once been the highest-paid child actress at Universal Studios. Baby Peggy was born Peggy Jean Montgomery in Merced, California, in 1918. Her father was a stunt writer who worked in westerns, and Peggy, as a toddler of 2, wandered onto a set one afternoon and caught the eye of a director. Within a year, she was making short comedies for Century Studios. By 4, she was starring in features. By 5, she was earning $1.5 million a year. She was, alongside Jackie Coogan, the biggest child star in the movies, and one of the highest-paid actresses of any age in Hollywood. Her parents managed her money, or rather, they spent it. Her father invested in oil wells that failed. Her mother spent lavishly on furs and homes. By 1929, when Peggy was 11 and her career was fading with the arrival of sound and the coming of the Depression, her family discovered that the millions she had earned were essentially gone. Everything had been spent or lost. Peggy tried to keep working. She played in some westerns as a teenager, using her real name, Peggy Montgomery. She did some radio. She married young to escape her parents, then divorced. She married again, more happily. She and her second husband, Robert Carey, moved to a small town in Texas in the 1940s and tried to run a bookshop. The bookshop failed. They moved to Fort Worth. She worked. In her late 30s and 40s, as a housekeeper, she worked as a bookkeeper. She raised 2 sons. She essentially never spoke about her past to anyone in Texas because no one there would have believed her. The idea that this quiet woman at the checkout counter had been Baby Peggy, the biggest child star in the world, was simply not credible in Fort Worth in 1955. In the 1970s, after her children were grown, Diana Sarah Carey, as she had been known for decades under her married name, began to write. She wrote a memoir about her childhood. She wrote a scholarly history of child stars in Hollywood. She wrote biographies of Jackie Coogan and of her contemporary Marion Davies. She became, in her 70s and 80s, one of the most respected historians of the silent film era, giving lectures at film festivals and writing books that are still used in university courses today. She lived to be 101 years old. She died in Gustine, California, on the 24th of February 2020, of natural causes. And she is, arguably, not a figure who was forgotten. She wrote her way back into the historical record. But her active career had ended when she was 11, and she had lived the 60 years between her career and her second life as a scholar in near total obscurity, working as a housekeeper in Texas, raising her children, and not telling anyone that she had once earned more in a year than the President of the United States. She is buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Fort Worth, alongside her husband Robert Carey. The marker gives her name as Diana Sarah Carey. There is no mention of Baby Peggy. It was a life she had left behind, and though she returned to it in writing, she did not want to lie under its shadow in death. We travel now to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, in the Great Mausoleum, in a niche that is not open to the general public. Here rests a man whose fall from grace is one of the most famous cautionary tales in the history of American film. John Gilbert was born John Cecil Pringle in Logan, Utah, in 1897. His parents were traveling actors, and his childhood was chaotic. He drifted into films as an extra in his teens and worked his way up through the 1910s. By 1924, he was a star. He appeared in The Big Parade in 1925, opposite Carl Dane, whom we visited earlier this evening. He appeared opposite Greta Garbo in Flesh and the Devil in 1926, and the two of them had a real love affair off-screen that Hollywood watched breathlessly. He appeared in more than 30 films through the late 1920s and was earning $10,000 a week, an unimaginable sum. And then, sound came. And an enduring Hollywood myth grew up around John Gilbert's first talkie, His Glorious Night, in 1929. The myth is that his voice was too high-pitched for audiences, that it did not match his romantic screen persona, that people laughed in the theaters. The truth is more complicated. Modern audio restorations of Gilbert's early sound films reveal a perfectly normal voice, not particularly high, not particularly odd. What actually happened, historians now believe, is a combination of poor sound recording technology, terrible dialogue in his first talkies, and a feud with MGM's Louis B. Mayer, whom Gilbert had reportedly slugged at a party in 1927 after Mayer said something insulting about Greta Garbo. Whatever the cause, Gilbert's career collapsed with astonishing speed. By 1932, he could not get parts. He drank heavily. He married the young actress Virginia Bruce in 1932, hoping the fresh start would help. It did not. The marriage lasted a year. John Gilbert died of a heart attack on the 9th of January, 1936, at his home on Tower Grove Drive in Beverly Hills. He was 38 years old. He had been drinking heavily for years, and his heart simply gave out. He was found by a nurse who had been hired to look after him. His funeral was held at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills. Marlene Dietrich, with whom he had been having an affair at the time of his death, sat in the back and wept. Greta Garbo did not attend but sent flowers. Louis B. Mayer, who had reportedly worked to destroy Gilbert's career, sent nothing. His ashes were interred at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, in the Great Mausoleum, in a niche that is not open to the general public. He had been, 7 years before his death, one of the 2 or 3 biggest male stars in Hollywood, and he died at 38, essentially forgotten by an industry that had, in less than a decade, moved on to other faces. We continue our journey now to a small cemetery in Chatsworth, in the far northwest corner of the San Fernando Valley. Oakwood Memorial Park is a modest cemetery that has become, in recent decades, the resting place of several country music stars. Fred Astaire is buried here. Ginger Rogers is buried here. And in a plot in the older section rests a woman whose face was known to millions in the late 1940s. Her name was Andrea Leeds. She was born Antoinette Lees in Butte, Montana, in 1913. She grew up in California, attended UCLA, and was signed by Samuel Goldwyn in 1936. Her third picture was Stage Door in 1937, in which she played a struggling young actress named Kay Hamilton, opposite Katharine Hepburn and Ginger Rogers. Her performance, particularly a long tearful monologue near the end of the film, earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. She was 24 years old. She followed it with roles in The Goldwyn Follies, Youth Takes a Fling, and They Shall Have Music, opposite Joshua Heifetz. She was, in Hollywood terms, on her way. And then, in 1939, at the age of 25, Andrea Leeds walked away. She married a wealthy horseman named Robert Howard, and she quit acting entirely. She had one of the shortest careers of any Academy Award nominee in history. She and her husband bred racehorses. She raised 2 children. She lived a quiet, prosperous life in California, and, later, in Palm Springs. Her husband died in 1962. She married again, to a jockey named Ralph Pittman. That marriage ended in divorce. She spent her later years traveling. She rarely gave interviews. Andrea Leeds died on the 21st of May, 1984, at a hotel in Palm Springs. She was 70 years old. The cause of death was a stroke. She had been alone in her hotel room for at least a day when a chambermaid found her. There was no funeral notice in the trade papers. Most Hollywood historians who wrote about the Academy Awards did not realize she had died. She had been out of the industry for 45 years, and she had wanted it that way. She is buried at Oakwood Memorial Park in Chatsworth, in a plot she had chosen years earlier. The marker gives her married name. We travel now to Bellevue Cemetery in Lawrence, Massachusetts, a modest cemetery in a New England mill town far from the studios that had made her famous. Thelma Todd was born in Lawrence, Massachusetts, in 1906. She had been Miss Massachusetts in 1925 and came to Hollywood as one of the winners of a Paramount contest for beautiful young women. She had a sharp wit that translated beautifully to comedy. She worked with Laurel and Hardy in a series of shorts. She played opposite the Marx Brothers in Monkey Business and Horse Feathers. She was, by the early 1930s, one of the most in-demand comediennes in Hollywood. On the morning of the 16th of December, 1935, Thelma Todd's maid found her body in the driver's seat of her convertible, in a garage above a restaurant she co-owned on the Pacific Coast Highway. She had died of carbon monoxide poisoning. The coroner ruled it accidental, though the details never quite added up. She had been at a party the night before. She had come home late. Her clothes were rumpled, but she was still wearing her evening gown and jewelry. The garage was several flights of stairs above her apartment, and it was not clear why she had climbed to it. There have been theories for 88 years. She was murdered by her ex-husband. She was murdered by Lucky Luciano, who had reportedly been pressuring her to let him use her restaurant as a gambling front. She had taken her own life. She had accidentally locked herself in the garage to keep warm after finding her apartment door locked. The Los Angeles District Attorney convened a grand jury. No indictment was returned. The case has never been solved. She was 29 years old. Her body was returned to Massachusetts and buried at Bellevue Cemetery in Lawrence, where her family had a plot. I have brought her into this list because her death, though it made headlines at the time, faded from public memory with astonishing speed. The Marx Brothers films she starred in are still watched. Her name is rarely mentioned. She had been at the peak of her career when she died, and Hollywood essentially wrote her out of its history within a decade. Her family plot is a modest one in New England, far from the studios that had made her famous, and few visitors from Hollywood have ever made the trip. We travel now to Hollywood Forever Cemetery, in Section 8, to visit a grave that lay unmarked for more than 50 years. Florence Lawrence was, in 1910, the most famous actress in America. She was called the Biograph Girl because she starred in the Biograph Company's films, and in an era when film actors were not credited by name, she was the first movie star, meaning the first performer whose name the public knew and demanded to see. Carl Laemmle, the head of IMP Studios, engineered her transition by planting a false story in the newspapers about her death, then dramatically revealing that she was alive and now under contract to IMP. It was one of the first great publicity stunts in the history of American film. It also worked. Florence Lawrence appeared in nearly 300 films between 1908 and 1914. She was earning $250 a week at her peak, a very substantial salary. She was engaged to the actor Harry Salter, then married another actor. She invested her money in real estate. She was, by every appearance, a woman who had made it. Then in 1915, she was seriously injured on the set of a film called Pawns of Destiny when a fire got out of control, and she inhaled a large amount of smoke while helping other actors escape. She was hospitalized for months. Her career never fully recovered. She made a few more films through the 1920s but was reduced to bit parts by the end of the decade. She lost her real estate holdings in the 1929 crash. She was working as an extra at MGM in the 1930s, uncredited, unrecognized by most of the young stars around her. She developed a bone disease that caused her intense pain in her hips and back. On the 28th of December, 1938, Florence Lawrence, alone in her small apartment in Beverly Hills, drank ant poison. She was found in time by a neighbor, but she died at Beverly Hills Emergency Hospital several hours later. She was 52 years old. Her note read, "Call Bob, please. Dear Bob, I'm tired. Hope this works. Goodbye, my darling. They can't cure me, so let it go at that. Lovingly, Florence. P.S. You've all been swell guys. Everything is yours." Her body was buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in an unmarked grave paid for by a small collection taken up by fellow extras at MGM. She was, in 1938, so completely forgotten that most obituaries did not mention that she had been the first movie star in the history of the American cinema. The grave remained unmarked until 1991, when a British actor named Roddy McDowall, who had become an amateur historian of silent film, paid for a headstone to be installed. She lay unmarked for 53 years. She had invented the very idea of the movie star, and no one had bothered to write her name on the stone. We travel now to Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles, the third of our stops in this old Catholic cemetery. Marie Prevost is here. Ted Healy is here. And in another modest plot rests a woman whose face is one of the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century. Evelyn Nesbit was born in Tarentum, Pennsylvania, in 1884. Her father died when she was 11, and her mother moved the family to Philadelphia and then to New York City. Evelyn began modeling at 14. She was extraordinarily beautiful in the specific way that early 20th century photography loved: dark, curly hair, pale skin, large, expressive eyes. Charles Dana Gibson drew her for his Gibson Girl illustrations. She modeled for the artist James Carroll Beckwith. She sat for the sculptor George Gray Barnard. Her face was on the cover of Vanity Fair, on candy boxes, on advertisements for everything from cold cream to bicycles. At 16, she began an affair with the architect Stanford White, who was in his late 40s. White was, at the time, one of the most famous architects in America. He had designed the original Madison Square Garden. He had designed the Washington Square Arch. He kept a red velvet swing in a private apartment on West 24th Street, and he had a fondness for very young women. Evelyn Nesbit was one of a number of teenage girls he had involved himself with. In 1905, at the age of 20, Evelyn married Harry K. Thaw, the mentally unstable heir to a Pittsburgh coke and railroad fortune. Thaw had been obsessed with her for years, and he had grown pathologically jealous of her past with Stanford White. On the night of the 25th of June, 1906, at the rooftop theater atop the original Madison Square Garden, Harry K. Thaw walked up to Stanford White during a performance and shot him 3 times in the face at point-blank range. White died instantly. Thaw was arrested, and what followed was one of the most sensational trials in American history. 2 trials, actually. The first ended in a hung jury. The second acquitted Thaw by reason of insanity, and he was sent to a state mental hospital. Evelyn Nesbit's testimony was the centerpiece of the trial. She was, at 22, the most famous woman in America. Newspapers followed her every move. She was called upon to describe her experiences with Stanford White in graphic detail before a national audience, at a time when such things were not spoken about at all. The experience seems to have permanently damaged her. Her marriage to Thaw ended in 1915. She had a son, whom Thaw refused to acknowledge. She tried to become an actress. She appeared in some films and on the vaudeville stage. Her name drew audiences at first, but she was a mediocre performer, and by the mid-1920s the offers had dried up. She drank heavily. She attempted suicide several times. She was in and out of legal trouble through the 1930s. She lost custody of her son. She moved to California in the late 1930s and worked as a ceramics teacher and as a cabaret performer under different names. She lived, in her later years, in a small apartment in the Van Nuys section of Los Angeles. She was almost entirely forgotten by the public. When she was interviewed in the 1950s by researchers writing about the White murder, she was described as a small, tired old woman living in a walk-up apartment, surviving on Social Security. She had once been the most photographed woman in America. She had testified in the trial of the century. She had married a fortune. And she was living, at 70, on less than $200 a month. Evelyn Nesbit died at a nursing home in Santa Monica on the 17th of January 1967. She was 82. Her son, from whom she had been estranged for decades, arranged for her burial. She was interred at Calvary Cemetery in East Los Angeles, in the same cemetery where Marie Prevost and Ted Healy lie. Her grave marker is small and gives her name as Evelyn Nesbit Thaw. It does not mention the modeling. It does not mention the trial. It does not mention that she had once been one of the most famous women in the world. 3 of the women we have visited tonight lie within a few hundred yards of each other, in the same Catholic cemetery, in a corner of Los Angeles that most film tourists never visit. Let us go now to a cemetery in Queens, New York. Mount Zion Cemetery is a Jewish cemetery in the borough, founded in 1893. And, in a plot near the back, rests a man who was, briefly, one of the most beloved comic performers of the American stage and screen. Burt Wheeler was born Albert Jerome Wheeler in Paterson, New Jersey, in 1895. He began in vaudeville and by 1927 had been paired with a straight man named Robert Woolsey. Wheeler and Woolsey became one of the top comedy teams in America. They appeared in the 1929 Ziegfeld production of Rio Rita on Broadway and reprised their roles in the 1929 RKO film version. RKO signed them, and between 1929 and 1937, Wheeler and Woolsey made 21 films together. Their brand of comedy, gentler and more musical than the Marx Brothers, more absurd than Laurel and Hardy, was enormously popular. At their peak, they were said to be RKO's most profitable stars after Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Robert Woolsey died of kidney disease in 1938 at the age of 50. He and Wheeler had been genuinely close, and Wheeler was devastated. He tried to continue as a solo comedian. He appeared in a few B pictures, and on the vaudeville circuit as long as it existed, and later in nightclubs. None of it worked as well without Woolsey. The chemistry that had made him a star was gone. Burt Wheeler kept working, though. He appeared in the Broadway production of Hobo, and in a number of failed shows. He toured with the Shrine Circus. He did a great deal of charity work for children's hospitals. He was, by every account, a warm and generous man. But the comedy team he had been half of was almost entirely forgotten by the 1950s. When he appeared on the game show To Tell the Truth in 1963, none of the panelists recognized his name. He was living, in his last years, in a small hotel room in the Actors Fund home in Englewood, New Jersey. He had no money. His 2 marriages had ended in divorce. He had a daughter from whom he was estranged. Burt Wheeler died at the Actors Fund home on the 18th of January, 1968, of emphysema. He was 72. His funeral was small and was paid for by the Actors Fund. He is buried at Mount Zion Cemetery in Queens, in a plot that was, for many years, unmarked. A small stone was eventually added by an admirer. Wheeler and Woolsey made 21 films together. Almost none of them are shown today. Most film historians who write about early sound comedy skip over them entirely to get to the Marx Brothers. And Burt Wheeler, who had once headlined at the Ziegfeld Follies, died in a room provided by charity, unrecognized on television, unknown to a generation of comedy fans who had grown up on the films of his exact contemporaries. We return now to Ferncliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York, where we visited Susan Peters earlier this evening. There is another grave here we should stop at, in a different section of the mausoleum, and it belongs to a man whose face millions of American children knew from Saturday matinees. Buster Crabbe was born Clarence Lyndon Crabbe II in Oakland, California, in 1908. He was raised in Hawaii and was a champion swimmer in high school and at the University of Southern California. He won a bronze medal in the 1928 Olympics in Amsterdam and a gold medal in the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles. Paramount signed him almost immediately, hoping to make him another Johnny Weissmuller. Crabbe was tall, blonde, and impossibly built, and he had a warm, easy manner in front of the camera. He played Tarzan once, in the low-budget 1933 serial Tarzan the Fearless. He played Buck Rogers in 1939, but his greatest role, the one that made him a hero to a generation of American children, was Flash Gordon. He played Flash Gordon in 3 serials between 1936 and 1940, and the character became one of the most beloved of the entire serial era. Buster Crabbe worked constantly through the 1940s and 1950s. He made westerns. He hosted a children's television show. He ran a summer camp for boys called Camp Buster Crabbe in the Adirondacks. He was, by every account, one of the nicest men in Hollywood, and he lived his life without scandal. His career slowed in the 1960s. His last major role was in a 1965 western called Arizona Raiders. He moved to Arizona and spent his final years there. His life did not have the collapse that so many of the people we have visited tonight had. He had a good marriage that lasted more than 50 years. He had children who loved him. He was not broke. He was not addicted to anything. What Buster Crabbe was, at the end, was forgotten. The serials he had starred in were considered old-fashioned by the 1970s. Children who had once run to see him on Saturday afternoons had grown up, and their children had grown up, and Flash Gordon meant nothing to the audience of Star Wars. He gave interviews late in his life, and he was gracious about it. He signed autographs at conventions. But he lived quietly in Arizona, and when he died of a heart attack in Scottsdale on the 23rd of April 1983, at the age of 75, the obituaries were short. He had been a genuine Olympic champion and one of the most recognizable action stars of an entire era of American moviegoing. His grave is at Ferncliff, in the mausoleum, in a plot that gets few visitors. He had done nothing wrong. He had lived a good life. And still, in the way that time does its work, he had been forgotten by the culture that had made him a hero, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. I include him here not because he died alone, but because he died into a silence, and that silence is its own kind of forgetting. We travel now to a small Catholic cemetery in Union City, New Jersey. Holy Name Cemetery is not a place tourists visit. It is a working parish cemetery. And in a modest plot lies a man who was, in 1938, one of the biggest box office draws in America. Frank Morgan was born Francis Philip Wupperman in New York City in 1890. He was the youngest of 11 children in a wealthy family that had made its fortune importing Angostura bitters. He was educated at Cornell, drifted into the theater, and became, or fortune, by the 1920s, one of the most reliable character actors on Broadway. He made his first film in 1917. He signed with MGM in 1933 and appeared in more than 100 films over the next 15 years. You have seen him. Even if you don't recognize the name, you have seen him. He played the harried judge in The Shop Around the Corner. He played Aunt Polly's husband in Tom Sawyer. He was in Bombshell with Jean Harlow, in Naughty Marietta with Nelson Eddy and Jeanette MacDonald, in Boomtown with Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy. He was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor twice. And in 1939, he played 5 roles in a single film. He was the gatekeeper of the Emerald City. He was the guard who wouldn't let Dorothy see the wizard. He was the coachman of the horse of a different color. He was Professor Marvel, the traveling fortune teller Dorothy meets in Kansas, and he was, of course, the Wizard of Oz himself. Frank Morgan died of a heart attack at his home in Beverly Hills on the 18th of September 1949, at the age of 59. He had been working almost to the end. He had just completed a film called Any Number Can Play with Clark Gable. Here is what I want to note about Frank Morgan. He was not forgotten in his lifetime. He was famous when he died. His funeral was well attended. The obituaries were long. He is not a Carl Dane or a Bobby Driscoll or a Marie Prevost, but he is a specific kind of Hollywood ghost. When you see The Wizard of Oz on television, as millions of children and their parents still do every year, you are watching Frank Morgan. He is on your screen. His voice is in your ears. He is playing 5 separate characters. And he is, in that film, one of the great performances by a character actor in the history of American cinema. And nobody knows his name. That is a different kind of being forgotten. To be endlessly seen and never recognized. To be beloved without being known. To be, in some ways, more present in the culture than the great stars, and yet to leave no name behind. He is buried here at Holy Name Cemetery in Union City, New Jersey, in a family plot with the Wuppermans, under the name Frank Morgan. The marker is modest. There is nothing on it about the Emerald City. There is no gatekeeper on his grave, no Professor Marvel, no traveling wagon, just his name and his dates. Every year, when The Wizard of Oz airs, millions of viewers see him and do not know who he is. He is the most watched forgotten man in American film. Let us take one more long walk together. We travel now to Calvary Cemetery in Queens, New York. And in a modest plot lies a woman who was, in 1927, one of the great tragedians of the American theater. Jean Eagles was born in Kansas City, Missouri, in 1890. She grew up poor. She ran away from home at 15 and joined a traveling theatrical company. She made her way to New York, and by 1922 she was starring in the Broadway production of Rain, based on a Somerset Maugham short story. She played Sadie Thompson, a prostitute stranded on a Pacific island, and her performance was considered one of the greatest of the decade. She ran with the play for years. She came to Hollywood in the late 1920s to make her transition to film. She starred in The Letter in 1929, one of the first great sound films, and she was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress posthumously, because Jean Eagles was, by that point, dead. She had been addicted to heroin for years. She was also drinking heavily, and mixing both with a variety of prescription medications. She had been suspended by Actors' Equity in 1928 for erratic behavior during a play. She was struggling to hold herself together. On the 3rd of October 1929, Jean Eagles went to a private hospital in New York City for what was announced as treatment for eye problems. She was given a sedative. She died within minutes of receiving the injection. She was 39 years old. The cause of death was officially given as alcoholic psychosis complicated by a drug overdose. The specifics were kept from the papers. She had, in the 6 years before her death, been the most acclaimed dramatic actress on the American stage. And within a decade of her death, she was almost entirely forgotten. Kim Novak played her in a 1957 biographical film that took enormous liberties with the facts, and that has itself been largely forgotten. Her Broadway performances, of course, cannot be seen. Only The Letter and one other early sound film survive to give us any sense of what she was. Her grave at Calvary in Queens is a modest one. There is no mention of Rain, no mention of The Letter, no mention of the Academy Award nomination she received after she was already in the ground. She had been, briefly, one of the great performers of her era. She had died at 39 of what we would now recognize as an addiction crisis in a private hospital on the recommendation of a doctor who was trying to help her. And within a generation, almost no one who saw her name would have any idea who she was. Let us stop now. We could go on. There are hundreds of these stories. There are cemeteries in every state where beloved figures from the movies lie under stones that give only their names, or that give a professional name their family did not want to use, or that give nothing at all because there was no one to pay for the stone. We could talk about the silent stars whose graves were unmarked for decades until fans took up collections. We could talk about the character actors whose faces you know from a dozen classic films and whose names no one has spoken aloud in 50 years. We could talk about the child stars who grew up without the tools to be adults, and who died young in ways that no one wants to describe. What I want to leave you with tonight is this. Every person we have visited was someone whose face once made audiences lean forward in the dark. Every one of them made a choice, at some point in their youth, to try to entertain the world for a living. Every one of them succeeded at that choice, some for a night, some for a decade, some for longer. And every one of them lived long enough to watch the culture that had celebrated them turn its attention elsewhere. There is a particular loneliness that belongs to the forgotten famous. It is not the same as ordinary loneliness. It has a texture the rest of us can barely imagine. It is the loneliness of having been seen by millions and then not seen by anyone. It is the loneliness of walking down a street where, 10 years earlier, you could not walk without being stopped, and having no one look at you at all. It is the loneliness of dying in a rented room, or a boarding house, or a small apartment in a city where the studios you once ruled still hum with light every night. The people we visited tonight did not choose their forgetting. It was done to them by an industry that uses people up faster than it can remember them, and by a public that always wants the next face. If we can do one small thing tonight, it is to say their names aloud, in the order in which the world stopped saying them. Peg Entwistle, Carl Dane, Alma Rubens, Marie Prevost, Hattie McDaniel, Mabel Normand, Guy Kibbe, Barbara Payton, Bobby Driscoll, Frances Farmer, Veronica Lake, Gail Russell, Susan Peters, Mae Murray, Ted Healy, Rita Jolivet, Baby Peggy, John Gilbert, Andrea Leeds, Thelma Todd, Florence Lawrence, Evelyn Nesbitt, Bert Wheeler, Buster Crabbe, Frank Morgan, Jean Eagles. There are more. There will always be more. Hollywood is a place where fame moves through people like weather. But tonight, at least, these people were remembered. Thank you for walking with me. Rest well. And if you pass a cemetery in the coming week, and you have a moment, stop and read a name. Any name. Someone was loved, once, whose stone you might be standing in front of. It is a small kindness, and it costs us nothing, and it may be the only thing that keeps any of us from disappearing entirely. Good night, friends.